coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Whenever I bemoan the quality and corruption of our modern food pyramid and all that stuff, my wife likes to make fun of me and call me a Marin housewife. So it's like the Marin housewife conservative convergence horseshoe.
They don't expect you to eat enough protein in the nutrition facts. I will definitely on that hill I will die. Go on.
Yeah, it's the food pyramid. This is it's less a conspiracy theory now and just kind of established fact, especially as more nutritionists look at it and various political stripes. But it's basically the pyramid should be upside down. They recommend a bunch of grains and not much fat and a little protein, and it should be probably something at least more balanced, if not the opposite. And if you look into it's classic sort of libertarian capture, right? I mean, it turns out the food pyramid was written at the behest of big agriculture and a bunch of the stuff they can make a lot of money off of.
Welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host for the week, Spencer Klavan, the Redditor-in-Chief of the American Mind. I'm joined this week by our publisher and president, Ryan Williams, and back for his second of many regular performances, assistant editor, Mike Sabo. Well, last week, right at the end of the pod, we got into talking about RFK Jr., and we were all kind of saying with some trepidation about not wanting to jinx anything that he looked like he was about to drop out and that he might endorse Trump, and maybe we could be provisionally white-pilled. It's always a nice, and for me, at least a rare day when your predictions are instantly confirmed, because we got, I think it was shortly thereafter that RFK did, in fact, drop out, endorse Donald Trump, cited a few of his kind of key stump speech issues that have been what he's running on this whole time: the war in Ukraine, the war on our children, as he puts it, and also a few of the kind of efforts by the Democrats to keep him off the ballot. So, in general, kind of an argument about free speech and the threats that the left poses to it at the moment. And for all these reasons said, therefore, if you were going to vote for me, I'm endorsing Trump. A few kind of interesting procedural points here before we get into talking about the significance, if any, of this development. We say that RFK dropped out. Technically, he only really intended to drop out kind of in the key swing states. He'd left himself up in places where it's unlikely to make a huge difference. So if you want to keep casting your protest vote for RFK, you can do it as long as it doesn't matter all that much, was kind of the top line item of what he wanted to do. He's also, though, after all this effort to get on the ballots and all these attempts to fight the resistance to that, now he's having a hard time getting off the ballot. The Wisconsin Elections Commission on Tuesday voted to keep him on the ballot. And this throws a wrench in his effort even to withdraw himself from the race in the way that he himself had hoped. So poor RFK Jr. just can't catch a break when it comes to ballot law and getting on and off ballots. But I'm interested in your guys' thoughts about that dimension of it, because I thought that was kind of a grace note not a lot of people were necessarily talking about. But let's start maybe with just, do you think this is going to matter? Will it help Trump? Will it do nothing? Is RFK Jr. irrelevant or crazy weirdo or the savior of our nation and the head of burgeoning third party for 2032 or whatever?
Not the last thing, I don't think.
No? A shock.
No, third parties are, it's the weird thing about just American politics, but because of our first past the post system and our national composition and institutional history, I mean, third parties don't really work here. But if they rise up, they quickly get absorbed. If they rise up in a threatening way, they get absorbed by one or two of the parties, or both in various ways. This is what happened to the progressive movement at the turn of the 20th century. Not for nothing did both Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, his successor. Both call themselves progressives in various ways, but it's a topic for another day. But I think they meant two different things. Taft's much less problematic than TR. So that's not really a thing. But I think in one way, J.D. Vance's comments on RFK dropping out show a little bit of what's been going on now for a long time, which is that, for lack of a better term, Kennedy Democrats have been moving to the Republican Party since Nixon's election, since the Southern strategy, and then subsequently for different reasons than the question of race and crime and the Old South and all that. So in a way, that the potential for a third party has just been accommodated by both parties in different ways. But I do think that he will make a difference for two reasons, at least, one from each side. RFK claimed in his speech about his dropping out of the race or getting off the ballot in 10 states and endorsing Trump, that his internal polling, for whatever it's worth, was suggesting that 57% or so of his voters would defect to Trump if he was out. So he thought that was enough to make a difference, in especially some of the close swing states. And then, as you say, Spencer, not only Wisconsin, but also Michigan, the kind of default left of center court system and litigation infrastructure of the DNC seems to think that he is consequential. Thus, they want to keep him on the ballot. Now, maybe you could say that they're just being overly cautious, but I think that reveals that they're a little worried about it. And then there's I don't know if RFK said it or not, but there's just the last name thing. I mean, I would be surprised if in this day and age, with the memory of the Kennedy family and even in some ways Bobby and JFK, especially for boomers of maybe the left and center left, or the middle and center left, the symbolic quality of him endorsing Trump has got to mean something. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see how this shakes out. Exit polling is always a tricky thing, but I think you'll have a decent sort of A/B testing. Well, it's not quite A/B, of course, or not really at all. But you'll have a test of him not on the ballot and on the ballot in a bunch of states that you should have some pretty good comparative statistics. But I hope it redounds to Trump's benefit, given the policy prescriptions and general attitude of the modern Democratic Party on the top of its ticket. I'd rather the other party win.
Yeah, I think a really interesting question is just looking at Kennedy, looking at the polling before, the polling after. Like Ryan said, his internal polling suggested that Trump was definitely going to get a boost. Just kind of doing just some research at ABC, they actually had polling where somehow it actually helped Harris slightly, Kennedy's move to Trump. So you just kind of wonder, is that just typical media bias, kind of what's going on there? But there was actually a New York Post survey that they cited, Echelon Insights, that actually now shows Trump beating Harris 49 to 48% in a one-on-one matchup. And when Kennedy was actually taken out, Trump actually gained about 3 percentage points. So that's major. Erin Burnett on CNN, the day that happened, that RFK made his announcement, she mentioned in swing states, look at some of the swing states where Kennedy is still getting, say, 4 to 6% of the vote, that could be major. And it just makes kind of intuitive sense, right? I mean, Kennedy, his constituency, who he was appealing to, certainly on abortion and some other, range. I mean, certainly a man of the left, but he definitely breaks with kind of the regime consensus on a whole host of things. You look at health, you look at just again, I think his general just war against the regime. You saw when he endorsed Trump. I mean, his members of his own family came out vociferously and acted like they were throwing him not only out of the Democratic Party, but actually out of the family entirely. So there's some serious consequences, obviously for him, which is interesting because Trump obviously had some of those same serious consequences. You look at what Mary Trump has been saying ever since 2016 for him. So it's a really interesting mix. It shows kind of the realignment going. You saw Tulsi Gabbard then come out. It sounds like the Trump said that there are going to be more Democrats who are going to be coming out in favor of him. But I think this just shows our ongoing realignment in politics, more broadly speaking, since 2016. I still think we're probably in the very early stages of it. But Kennedy is certainly a name, like Ryan said, a name that people know. And I think it does mean something. You look at just how the Democrats are reacting. They're trying to shove him off. But it really, I think, put some momentum in Trump's case, especially right after the DNC, where, usually candidates get a bump. But that happened right after that ended. So I think that maybe stole some of Harris's thunder. But in any event, it looks like the Democrats aren't exactly happy with Kennedy, and their own internal polling may suggest why that is.
Yeah, the ballot thing reminds me of my favorite children's book of all time, The Phantom Tollbooth by Norton Juster, which opens with the portrait of its main character, Milo, and it says whenever he was here, he wanted to be there, and whenever he was there, he wanted to be here. It's like whenever he was on the ballot, he wanted to be off the ballot, and whenever he was off the ballot, he wanted to be on the ballot. But both of you are raising, I think, perhaps the most interesting long-term question about this, which is, as you both say, we hope, and it seems feasible, plausible, that if he does, in places where he is taken off the ballot, that will be helpful for Trump. Ryan, you talk about the absorption of the third party movements, things like the Tea Party and the progressives before them, into one or the other of the two major parties. And it strikes me that there are at least two ways that that scenario can play out. One, I would describe as the Tea Party model, which is like the domestication or even just the neutering and the kind of evaporation of the energy in that movement. You might also say that happened to Occupy Wall Street. So the big party machine takes in this fresh energy and the whatever's taken to the streets, and then it just gets fizzled out and dissipated and ceases really to become a significant force in party politics until some new uprising comes along. Like if you think about Trump as kind of the Tea Party 2.0 in some ways, it took another outsider to spur that on. The other version of getting absorbed into the major parties is basically winning. I mean, it's that old argument that if people are making your arguments, you effectively start to win, even if you don't win a victory. So the progressives would be an example, perhaps, of a movement that got absorbed in a positive way for them, in that they shifted the Democrats in a progressive direction. I suspect BLM and the woke movement are like that. They are dissipated now as like socio-cultural forces. At least they're not as powerful as they were in 2020, but they've unquestionably spread their thought through the veins of the Democratic Party and moved them left on all sorts of issues and really become a dominant force, even though they didn't necessarily exactly nominate a BLM candidate to the head of the Democratic Party. You could argue Kamala is one, but she doesn't come from BLM. She's not part of that movement. All of this to say, RFK plainly represents some sort of variety of this groundswell movement. And if I had to put my finger on it, I would say it's what Mike is talking about, the shift of the crunchy granola Democrats. That the thing that seems most salient to me about him is this vaccine skepticism, this freewheeling kind of anti-war, almost hippie adjacent mentality that has changed its coding from left to right in recent years, and that RFK represented. Tulsi Gabbard, whom you mentioned, also kind of represents. And my question for you is, do you agree with me that that is sort of the most salient feature of RFK's movement? And if so, how and in what way is it about to get absorbed? Will it be neutralized by being taken in or swept off the stage in the wake of the two parties? Or will it effectively win by crafting the Republican Party in its own image?
The COVID thing is real. The vaccine skepticism part of it. You had the whenever I bemoan the quality and corruption of our modern food pyramid and all that stuff, my wife likes to make fun of me and call me a Marin housewife. So it's like the Marin housewife conservative convergence horseshoe.
They don't expect you to eat enough protein in the nutrition facts. I will definitely on that hill I will die. Go on.
Yeah, it's the food pyramid. This is sort of, it's less a conspiracy theory now and just kind of established fact, especially as more nutritionists look at it and various political stripes. But it's basically the pyramid should be upside down. They recommend a bunch of grains and not much fat and a little protein. and it should be probably something at least more balanced, if not the opposite. And if you look into its classic sort of libertarian capture, right? I mean, it turns out the food pyramid was written at the behest of big agriculture and a bunch of the stuff they can make a lot of money off of. So none of that's that surprising. The most annoying, just as an aside, the most annoying piece of it is, I think maybe I mentioned this before in the podcast, but it's been months and months at least. But there's I know Malcolm Gladwell can be kind of insufferable, but he has this great podcast episode on the demise of the delicious beef tallow fried French fry at McDonald's. And the switching in a lot of the fast food places from beef tallow to vegetable oil, that is corn oil mostly, was really just the product of one guy. I forget the guy's name, but he kind of became a guru for eliminating the threat of heart disease. And he somehow convinced a good part of the nutritional and medical establishment that saturated animal fats were a high contributor to heart disease. And that's how it all happened. And there might be cost reasons now. Of course, corn oil is a lot cheaper than beef tallow, but it's one of the reasons why McDonald's French fries in the 60s and 70s were much, much more delicious and healthier. So it's very sad. The one other thing, Spencer, I would say is the and it dovetails with the switching of sides on certain issues since Trump came to office in 2016, which is, the Democrats of the 60s, the anti-war movement and all that were great skeptics of sort of industrial America, and especially the man and the CIA and the intel services. The FBI was always setting up, in bad ways, the early Black Power movement, and they were the bad guys. And once Trump was elected, this all was perfectly encapsulated by Bill Kristol tweet, which is something along the lines of, I'd rather have the Hillary deep state than the Trump state, or something like that. So now the defenders of the status quo on the intelligence community is sort of the center left and the left, because they saw the intelligence community as a bulwark against Trump's abuses, and now that they've been in power for 3.5 years, their side can do no wrong in sort of tribal ways. So that's a big part of RFK Jr.'s constituency too, which is the skeptics of the conduct and attitude and imperiousness of the intelligence state, if you take that term kind of in the broad sense, over especially the last 16 years or so, but really longer than that.
Do you think, or either of you think, that sentiment will be neutralized or will
galvanized? So that would kind of depend on what cabinet position RFK Jr. gets.
Mm-hmm.
So, who knows? I mean, what could he get confirmed for? What are the internal dynamics? What has Trump promised him or quasi-promised him? All hard to say. I mean, I'd be much more comfortable, I think, with him somewhere in public health than I would be with the other thing I've read about, which is him as Attorney General. Although everyone's salivating at the prospects of Trump's apparent promise to RFK Jr. that they could open up the Kennedy assassination files and he could lead a commission to unearth what really happened. RFK Jr., of course, thinks the CIA killed his father. So, so I guess the neutralization would depend on what kind of position he gets, because then he could be a public figure and lightning rod for the desires and hopes and passions of that portion of his constituency. But like I said, that depends on a lot of indeterminate factors.
I think too, with that question, because that's a very good question, typically it seems like in movements where, one kind of minority position kind of gets eaten up, you do have, some basic kind of agreement though, between Trump and RFK already, which kind of makes me think RFK is going to be more successful in a possible Trump administration. You look at, on war, they're both bashing neocons. You look at on some other things too, just the regime in general, the CIA, intelligence agencies. You look at censorship. I think free speech is another big one where there's a lot of agreement on those things. Obviously, again, disagreement on some other things, but I think that does give me some hope that RFK will be able to survive, will be able to kind of carve out his niche, bring his people along. Whether he's at, say, Health and Human Services or, like Ryan said, Attorney General, Department of Justice, that's an interesting question. My guess is I would assume the former and not the latter. I don't know who even Trump would have as AG. That's obviously going to be a very pivotal position in his possible administration, especially with just seeing kind of what happened the last time. But it's an interesting coalition. I was even just listening to the long interview that RFK did with Tucker, and just talking about some of the same themes that Democrats have talked about: wealth inequality. Wealth is heavily tilted now, though, as RFK said, to the Dems. The Dems, I think, he said, if you look at the breakdown income between Democrats and Republicans, they own like 70% of the wealth. I mean, it's heavily, heavily tilted in that direction. Daryl Paul in First Things, actually, I think a couple of years ago, did a really good piece just looking at the top 10 zip codes and seeing, it's all D now. I think that was even the 2018 election. So this is a real thing. This is a real shift. And RFK, I mean, he has some oddities too. I mean, he's talking about, kind of how the divine shows up in the environment. So that's why we need to protect the environment, which is a really interesting thing, kind of gets into more Christian theology about natural revelation and the importance of that. And it's almost like in some ways, I mean, he's kind of perfect for really this medium of podcasting. I think that's probably one of the things, even with the voice that he does have, but I think that propels him too. He's interested in talking about some issues that the Democrats especially absolutely do not want to talk about. He's talking about the problem of wind farms, and what they do to birds. He's talking about a lot of the, I think, like whaling and things like that, and just a lot of the environmental policies that Democrats have been floating for a long time that have actually had absolutely deleterious consequences that, again, they just don't want to talk about. So I think that is just the shift in the Democratic Party. And I think it could be, we'll see. I mean, it could be a possible situation where the Republicans historically, it's like the Whig Party and something new will come of it. I don't know. That's way too early to figure out, although Trump certainly does have more of a hold of power over the current Republican Party than he certainly did in 2016. But it remains to be seen. But there are definitely signs, I think, of a different alignment emerging sooner, probably, rather than later.
I liked the Babylon Bee headline that RFK's voice was fixed when he finally took a single sip of water. It was very funny. Yeah, I mean, it does. These are all good points. It definitely seems as if, first of all, Trump is more sympathetic to the RFK position than, say, Con Inc. was to the Tea Party. So that makes for possible integration, or at least makes one much more likely. And then it also seems like RFK is better as kind of a wing of the new Republican Party or the new right, rather than as a coherent ideology unto himself. I'm still unsure whether the nature worship stuff is Christian ecology or paganism or what, but I don't think those are the sorts of questions you're supposed to think too deeply about when it comes to RFK. You just like put him in one of these cabinet positions and move on. Well, we'll keep an eye on that, but let's turn our attention now to this really, I just think, kind of wild.
Sorry, Spencer. My last thing is, I just want to highlight for everyone who didn't catch it. It's pretty hard to disagree with RFK Jr.'s little segment of the Trump slogan, which is "Let's make America healthy again." Amen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Totally agree.
No question. The food pyramid is just the beginning. We don't even have to crack that seed oil can open. We'll just talk about that. That's a topic for another episode, for sure. And before we go down that rabbit hole, I'm going to turn us to this Disney case. I find this it's a sensationalist story, and it has really rich and interesting implications. I think it raises a whole host of issues that we probably don't talk about enough. So the underlying facts of the matter here is there's a case that was brought against Disney by an individual, Jeffrey Piccolo, who, and this is a tragic story, he was eating at a restaurant, Raglan Road Irish Pub in Orlando, not in Disneyland exactly, but in that kind of area outside of Disneyland. It's called Disney Springs. If you've been to Disneyland in Orlando, in Florida, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If not, this is just sort of a periphery where you can eat at all these different restaurants that are not Disney restaurants. They are hosted by Disney and obviously pay rent to Disney. But Jeffrey Piccolo is eating at this Irish pub with his wife, who has some severe allergies. And he alleges that both Disney and the pub made a big show of accommodating the kinds of allergies that his wife had, when tragically his wife went into anaphylactic shock and it was revealed that there was dairy and nuts in her system. So Piccolo brings this case against Disney, whereupon Disney tries to take him to arbitration, which, if, like me, you're not a lawyer, arbitration is basically a sort of side court whose records are not public, presided over by a retired judge. And it's often something that corporations will use, sometimes to the benefit of all parties, to take things out of the court system and into a more closed off and limited, efficient area where you can kind of have these discussions. That's why it's called arbitration in the first place. But there's also something called mandatory arbitration, which is when you sign up at the outset in whatever contract you're in with, say, your employer or whoever, that the employer can take you to arbitration whether or not you want to. And Disney, after first making a few other arguments, such as that this was not their restaurant, that they were just the landlord of this pub and so forth, then brought another argument, which is that this needed to go to arbitration because Piccolo had signed up for a free trial of a Disney Plus subscription. And in those interminable TOCs, those terms and conditions that you sign up to whenever we were all party to a million of these agreements in the modern era. But in Disney's, as in many others, there's mandatory arbitration. And so because Piccolo had done this, not even because he had a subscription, but just because he had once clicked, yes, I agree, Disney argued they were going to take him to arbitration over this completely unrelated situation that involving the death of his wife. Now, naturally, whether or not this was a valid legal argument, which I hope we'll get into, and whether or not it was a wise strategy on Disney's part, it was certainly a PR disaster for Disney to be forcing this man whose wife just died, this widower, into arbitration. And Disney, in fact, has backed out and said, we're going to do this in open court instead because they got caught. But they will say because we recognize the sensitivity of the matter. I want to know what you guys make of this whole thing. In particular, I'm interested in this question of terms and conditions. The Supreme Court has upheld mandatory arbitration and upheld, in general, in a number of cases, been sort of favorable toward what seems to me like an absurd situation and kind of an anti-Republican government situation. We're all party to these agreements that nobody can read. But tell me I'm wrong, or tell me Disney's in the right here, or what should we make of all this?
No, I think you're exactly right. You look at, and I think you hit the nail on the head with looking at, how does this exactly cohere with Republican government? You have these massive user agreements where you click yes. I mean, in 2.5, on page 75, you could actually be giving away the mortgage of your house. You just don't even know it. So that's a huge problem. And it actually, and especially just doing the Lincoln Fellowship and just doing some of the readings there, my mind just goes back immediately to James Madison's Vices of the Political System. And that was something that he wrote against the Articles of Confederation and showing the problems with the government under the Articles. And one of the main problems is the laws. It's the number of the laws, the mutability of the laws. No one knows what actually the laws are because they're so numerous. And so I think you see this problem with this, where this is really a creature, really probably going back to the early progressives of kind of the modern administrative state, where experts, so-called, are kind of insulated off from the public will. They're churning out these things right and left. They're working with big corporations who then also are basically looking, kind of over their shoulder, kind of like that meme of Mr. Bean kind of looking at the guy next to him. And they're kind of just copying what the administrative state is doing because they have to in order to survive in this kind of realm. And it's just a huge complex web that binds customers. And you see the problems right in this case. The lawyer for Disney actually said, okay, because the public outcry, I think probably partially, maybe totally, was so much that they are actually going to take this case to court now, just because I think people couldn't believe and were stunned that Disney actually made those kinds of arguments. So this is a problem, again, that really goes to the heart of who we are as a nation. Are we a Republican government? Are we just kind of this kind of sclerotic kind of oligarchy lorded over by the administrative state? Who are we?
I think that's right, Mike. And it also, if you go back to the early origins of contract law, an old principle is that to have a contract be valid, you have to have some meeting of the minds and more or less equal knowledge of what the terms are by both parties. Now, the other side could argue, well, you clicked on the terms of service and you agreed to them. You could sift through that like 95-page document that's all written in legalese, and you should do that with every one of those things that you click. And I think from just a common sense point of view, that can't be the case because no one has the time to do that sort of thing. I mean, how many terms of services do we agree to every year with all these digital products we might buy, let alone, the implicit agreement to terms of service or the rules of a place when you buy Disney tickets. I mean, that was the other part, Spencer. They also claimed that having purchased tickets to booked travel tickets, somehow they were also agreeing to these broader terms of service. That all just, at a certain point, you have to fall back on the common sense of the thing. And that's a bedrock of small R Republican government. You have to have sets of rules and regulations that are cognizable and understandable by the average American. You have to have that. That's the true meaning of having a rational form of government, not in the progressive sense of it being bureaucratic and Hegelian rationalistic and it all making sense, but in the sense of just normal people being able to understand what they're agreeing to. So it gets at a problem that actually was raised by, I don't know if you all saw this, but Trump sat down with very popular podcaster, comedian Theo Vaughn. And Theo has this great, one of his shticks is he's just sort of everyday dude. And he's like, what's up with that? This seems crazy. And he asked, which is, partly his personality and partly genuine, but also he plays it up. But he asked Trump, what's the most powerful lobby in the federal system? And Trump said, a lot of people don't know this, but it's the lawyers. And I think Trump meant the trial attorney bar, but it might just be a bigger, more general lawyers lobby. But that gets to one of these themes of the problem of the modern managerial state, which is or the rise of managerialism, which is a kissing cousin with progressivism, but not quite the same thing, because it has spread across corporate life as well. And which is to say, the complex rules that can only be understood by lawyers not only benefit the lawyers and the big corporations. It's a kind of rentier system where you have this whole class of people making money off this esoteric knowledge that, under an older understanding of contracts and all the rest, really shouldn't exist. So what do you do about all that in a very complex industrial society where often through decades and decades of precedent and litigation, you have to have these longer terms of service as corporations try to protect themselves from frivolous lawsuits. But on the other side, there's a lot of room for abuse of normal citizens. And you're Disney and you have on staff, what's the legal counsel's department at Disney? It's probably hundreds of people. They can just throw everything they got with their people on staff who do this all the time at normal Joe Schmo citizen, and he'll just give up at a certain point. It'll be too expensive. So it's a great analog with the problem of the administrative state and regulatory agencies burying citizens in rules, and then if you want to appeal them, you're looking at a 2-year process and hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's if we want to restore some real Republican, small R Republican equity to our legal system, we need broad reform on this front. And some states are better than others, and there should be some work there for Congress as well.
Yeah, it's been pointed out that the lawyers in this case are just doing what lawyers do. Corporate lawyers that are in-house for media companies and lawyers generally are paid to literally throw the book at you. So they did that. It just happened that this one looked particularly bad. And I actually asked an in-house media company corporate lawyer that I know, like, what would you have done in this situation? And he said, I'd have raised the possibility with an executive. And then the executive would have told me, that looks bad, don't do that. So obviously Disney made a mistake there, just probably didn't pay enough attention. But here is what I, for the life of me, do not understand. Okay, so it's like, yeah, you can totally agree to the terms of service. Like, just retain independent counsel on hand for any time you want to watch Hulu, right? Like, what's the problem? So yes, this is obviously unworkable for your average American and benefits corporations like Disney. But if you've ever entered into an actual contract, for example, where both parties involved actually want to understand what they're agreeing to and have good faith and good intentions of reaching the proper terms, very often the first thing that you will receive is a deal points memo with like 5 bullet points saying what you guys intend to agree to. It's not a contract, it's not binding, but you first have to work out, negotiate those 5 bullet points and sign that document. Then the lawyers go away and they do their lawyer thing where they write completely incomprehensible gobbledygook that you would need to pay somebody hundreds of dollars an hour to read and understand for you. And that's their job. And then they bring you the contract and they basically say, and perhaps your lawyer says, like, this says in legalese what that said in bullet point form. And there are even some companies that will put those bullet points basically next to their terms of service voluntarily because they actually don't want to look like they're trying to hoodwink you into some ridiculous contract to like sell your soul or your firstborn child or whatever. If they can do that, and if people who are entering into contractual agreements do that literally every day, why can we not make it mandatory to do? I mean, and if we can mandate that cereal companies put nutrition facts on their boxes, where you get the top line of every, macronutrient that you're getting in this cereal. Why can we not just say you have to give the deal points along with the terms of service so that ordinary people can read them? And while we're at it, you got to do that on a law too, so that Congress people can read the thing they're voting on before they send it to the president's desk. Why hasn't the Supreme Court said something like that, or Congress tried to say something like that? Am I being too like statist somehow by insisting that is that like government getting involved in businesses? What's the problem with that? Possibly.
Well, in the last 50 years, there's been some attempts at that at the congressional level with the Congressional Research Service, and then at the executive level with the Office of Management and Budget and scoring legislation. What would it cost? All that sort of stuff. So, yeah, that's definitely been one of the motivating factors in what we used to call the goo movement, the good government movement, of which, to harken back to our last segment, RFK Jr. has been, a litigator in for a long time, especially on issues of false advertising and all the rest. So, it's out there. The sentiment is out there. I just want to crack. No, it's not really a joke, but I'll just say, as usual, South Park was there first. I will not describe the details of this episode in that much because it's not fit for family programming, but they had this episode probably 15 years ago now, if not 20, called Human Centipede. And it was a play on Human Centipede, this pretty gruesome horror movie. I will describe this delicately, where a nasty individual kidnapped a bunch of people and put them end to end with their digestional tracts all connected from front to end, if you know what I mean. And so South Park guys, instead of human centipede, said human centipede, is as in iPad. And it turns out the kids had agreed in the terms of service with Apple that they could be forced into such an arrangement to much sort of scatological and gross, funny effect when it's all cartoons and all the rest. So
I stumbled across
just a cultural reference point. It's just funny.
I had only ever heard that phrase as cultural reference, and only just recently stumbled across the vinyl album of the original movie soundtrack, which then prompted me to read the description of this, I guess, cult horror classic. You people are disgusting. That I cannot believe that's an actual movie that exists. Anyway, yes, okay, that all
it's like if Fear Factor met Saw. That's sort of what that horror movie was like.
I don't want to think about that anymore, which means that I think we should move on to our next topic and our last topic. Speaking of horrors beyond your human comprehension, let's talk about abortion and the abortion debate. We touched on this last time, but Mike had the good idea that we could sort of address it a little bit more. And that is this developing and I think kind of novel intra-right debate about, well, I think there's two prongs to this, actually. And I'll lay out this framework and then you can tell me that it's wrong or complicated or whatever. The first prong is about the philosophical and indeed constitutional right answer in kind of your Platonic seminar room, if you were sitting around and discussing what pro-lifers should want and how they should go about pursuing their aims. And one party to that debate, namely, I would say the more aggressive and conservative party, wants to use, for instance, the 14th Amendment and the right to life more generally to argue that this is a constitutional issue and therefore should be decided nationwide, either by act of Congress or perhaps even by constitutional amendment specifying that the persons who are guaranteed right to life include unborn babies and from the moment of conception. Or a slightly softer version of that would be we should at least decide sort of when life begins as a constitutional matter, because it is that kind of dispute that, for example, slavery also raised, right? Who's a person? Who gets these protections? And there's a con law argument going on about whether that's correct or whether, because abortion would be a matter of criminal law, it must nevertheless rest with the states to decide, in the same way that, for instance, we allow states to write laws about murder, even though they couldn't decide that murder is legal. They do decide it in their own fashion. That's prong one. Prong two is, irrespective of or at least detached from the seminar room, what is the appropriate electoral and political strategy for accomplishing pro-life aims in the country? Even if abstractly, philosophically, this is an absolute question that needs nationwide decision, is it smarter first to take the question to the states, allow Republican politicians to refrain from taking a hardline stance on this one way or another so that they can get elected in areas where there's not a lot of public support for pro-life arguments, make the argument person to person, neighbor to neighbor, state to state, until gradually public opinion shifts to the extent that you could feasibly talk about nationwide abortion bans or restrictions and so forth. Or final option is that whole idea of a nationwide law on this topic misguided to begin with, and what we should now enter into is simply an indefinite period of time where, for the rest of our nation's history, it's the states that decide this based on debate and dispute within their local communities.
No, those are really the key questions. For really the first one, so I think Josh Craddock is the guy who has been making most forcefully that 14th Amendment point. The personhood, the person mentioned in the 14th Amendment applies to babies in womb. That argument, though, I don't know if that's been in any kind of litigation, if that's been in any kind of briefing or anything like that. I just don't know to the extent of that, but I know that he is one guy out there. And I think that may speak to the problem of that argument is so early on. And it actually would be interesting too, actually looking back to the 14th Amendment, 1868, some of those debates to see if abortion was actually mentioned at all in any way, shape, or form. I know that there were certainly laws on the states at that time about it. but I think it's so, new in a way, and I just don't know if it's mainstreamed even among kind of the legal conservative establishment. I'm just not sure. So I'd be wary of, kind of that being, a central argument where enough people are kind of on board now. And then going to, the federal versus the states, you look back in the Dobbs decision, and certainly the majority opinion did leave it open for federal legislation, that it wasn't just states have the right to do this. The problem is, though, is that currently in Congress, I just don't see even, Republicans, even if they had the votes to be able to really kind of pull that off. I just don't even see a vote like that even being scheduled by the current kind of establishment that we have in the Republican Party. So I think it really does depend on the states. You look at what's happened in the states thus far. Really, pro-life laws, unfortunately, have gone really 0 for 7. There are 10 more states, I think, coming up here. And that's going to be kind of critical to what happens kind of going forward. Say if somehow they go 0 for 17, that is going to be really, really damaging to the movement. And I just hope that kind of the pro-life movement is ready for what's coming. And I just think it's going to be a long-term thing. I think it's really kind of a thing outside of politics too. I mean, there are a lot of things that have to change in the culture. You look at no-fault divorce. You look at a bunch of other just policies that we kind of take for granted today. That I think so. It's a cultural problem too, and the answer might actually be culture more than politics. Although laws can certainly help. You look at survey after survey after survey, though, and this country. I mean, I would say a decent amount of people are supportive of abortion in the first trimester. I would say you look at especially polling with Gen Z men and women. Women are getting much more liberal and abortion is much more important to them. And so abortion, even though, Roe is obviously overturned, we're kind of in still a pivotal moment now where it can really kind of fall either way. But I think anyway, it's going to be a long-term project.
I guess I'll take all three questions wrapped into one, Spencer. But I'll start by saying Josh Craddock, who's a former John Marshall Fellow of the Claremont Institute, among other things. Josh, the if you want the best case or one of the better cases of a young, very intelligent, practicing attorney who's passionate about the pro-life cause, making the logical argument about life, rights, and federal structure, Josh makes a compelling case. But then we're led always, as always, back to the prudential problems, which Mike has laid out a lot of them. And you can start with the current debate around the presidential race and the thing we've brought up before, which is, how much should pro-lifers, ardent pro-lifers, maybe single issue pro-life voters stay home in the next race because of what they see as Donald Trump's and J.D. Vance's trimming on this issue. For crass political reasons as they see them. Some of us are led to the, look, if politics is about prudence and about doing more good than harm or avoiding the most harm possible, it seems the case is pretty clear on that issue that throwing the election to the party that's much worse on that topic in a variety of ways is a bad choice. So that's sort of the case against it in the macro sense. And, as well, and if you sort of run that down the line past just one election, okay, so say your national party was somehow, because of electoral majorities or even a Supreme Court makeup, able right now to impose a kind of life amendment through the 14th Amendment jurisprudence or through national legislation, et cetera. Let's leave aside the constitutional amendment for a second. But even if you could do it, most of the signs of where, as Mike said, where the culture and the politics are across all the states, if you somehow squeaked it through, you'd be faced with something, I think, like what happened to Obama and Obamacare on steroids, which is you would sacrifice your majorities for a lot longer than Obamacare took out his congressional majorities. He sacrificed some House seats, especially on this pyre that he'd built to get healthcare legislation through. So you would arguably do a lot more harm to the pro-life cause over the coming decades than if you had more of a gradualist approach. So, and then the constitutional amendment, look, a life amendment should be the ultimate goal of this movement, and I would agree with it. But we're so far from the point at which we could get an amendment through 2/3 of both houses of Congress, then ratified by 3/4 of the states on this issue, as to make it basically a non-starter politically for the time being.
Yeah.
So that points to what you were talking about, Mike. I mean, there's just got to be a lot more persuading done. There's got to be a much more robust presentation of the positive case across the 50 states experimenting with this issue. And there probably has to be quite a religious revival as well, a Christian religious revival, before you get anywhere near to doing what you really want to do on this issue. And if you did it in the meantime, I think the only real way to do it is to do some real violence to small R Republican government in America in the following sense. You know, I mean, and the common tie between abortion and slavery, of course, is on this question of life and rights and personhood, is the Declaration of Independence. And, you know, if all men are created equal, they are endowed with certain rights. And what follows from all men being created equal is government by consent in some form. And if you are unable to persuade a majority or supermajority of your fellow citizens, that is to get their consent for this sort of big lasting change after 70 years of some movement in the opposite direction, you know, you're doing something other than ruling with the consent of the governed. Now, the whole thing is very much complicated by just a common theme from our podcast since the beginning, which is we are such a closely divided country and deeply divided country on questions of anthropology, life, rights, and all the rest. You know, the best you're probably going to be able to do without complete national crack up is going to be the state strategy. So while pursuing your other tracks, you know, while pursuing the cultural cause, the million different ways in a country this large that you could press the case to your fellow citizens that morally and constitutionally they should be against limitless abortion and really against most abortions, if not all abortions. Yes, press that case, try to change hearts and minds. But I think the Supreme Court handing down that their previous ruling means that under the 14th Amendment, all abortions are a violation of equal protection is a fantasy and would lead to some sort of civic national crack up. And for the time being, getting it through Congress, there's all sorts of constitutional dubiousness of passing national legislation. I mean, it's sort of, sorry to keep rambling, but that's sort of the same argument as the 14th Amendment, because people forget about Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which is that Congress shall have power to enforce the provisions of this. So those are twin issues. And then the constitutional amendment side, you know, you're nowhere, not even within spitting distance of such a thing. So I'm all for pressing the creative ways of doing this. I would like more creative legislation along the lines of our friend Hadley Arkis's passion over recent decades. You know, he was a big mover for the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. And he said, look, he sort of implicitly acknowledged all the things I just brought up, the difficulties, et cetera. He said, at the very least, can we just make everyone vote on the prospect that should a baby survive an abortion, you can't then kill it, and force everyone to vote on this? That would be some moral progress. It would at least draw lines in the sand, and then we can go from there. That sort of stuff and more of it would be good.
No, that's really interesting. I mean, one of our ongoing complaints, conservatives' ongoing complaints about the court and leftist activists in other contexts, is this whole thing about substantive due process, which, Ryan, you indicated, right? It's Congress that's supposed to have the ability to enforce the 14th Amendment and so on and so forth. And I think, like, we probably, just as a matter of principle, want to stick to that here as well, which is why the more I think about the prudentialist question, the political issue, the more I think it's kind of a no-brainer. And I'm surprised at myself because I'm very persuaded, probably characterologically, this is bound to happen. I'm very persuaded by the philosophical arguments that these are actually absolute questions that you have to decide one way or another. But at a prudential level, like, the whole point of the slavery analogy is that even or perhaps especially in cases where the matter is so passionately offensive to the moral sensibility. The idea of discounting a whole class of people from personhood raises these absolute questions that stir naturally intense passions, unless you are willing to go to war over those questions, which is the natural other thing, is civil war. Unless you're willing to do that, you need to do what Lincoln did and exhaust every other possible attempt at compromise and gradualism. And it just doesn't seem as if we've done that. And it seems as if the people who are clamoring to not do that aren't really reckoning with what the actual alternative is, which is some kind of, if not war, physical violence, then some kind of like violent intervention into our system of government. All that having been said, like, I do think I'm a little bit more on the fence about whether constitutional amendment is the right thing or not. I see the force of the argument that states make murder laws, and so they should make these laws too. That said, I gestured in my introduction to this other thing, which is like, if Wisconsin legalized cold-blooded slaughter of random innocents, the Supreme Court would step in. So there are obviously limits, national limits, to what you can and can't legalize. And I do think that probably you're going to need to get the Supreme Court or Congress involved in that down the line once you've made all these other steps that you guys are talking about. The only last thing I'll throw in here, and then I'll shut up, is having come around to the gradualist prudentialist argument myself, I have one lingering thought about strategy, which is that the left is often very good at a kind of strategy in which they will make the maximalist demand of what they want, and maybe even a little bit more. Universal basic income, reparations now, defund the police. They make these demands in big slogans that initially seem completely bananas. And then what happens is everybody says, that's crazy, the left is bananas, but we can go like one step in that direction. And they do that like 20 times. And finally, you suddenly arrive at the place where you have gotten within the Overton window of doing the extreme thing because they made the case so boldly and extremely to begin with. And the one part of the conservative movement that has been successful in replicating that strategy, ironically, is the pro-life movement, which for 50 years made this case that nobody thought you could make, that you should overturn Roe v. Wade. And they insisted on that. They were always very clear about it. Everybody was like, that's never going to happen. And then slowly, they pushed it into the Overton window. So I'm saying this more as like, I wonder whether that should be a dimension, even as everybody says, like, quiet down, you kooky social conservative, stop being so extremist and evangelist about this. I wonder whether there isn't a place for the maximalist argument to be made, even if it's not made by people running for office, precisely to kind of push that idea and to move people by half degrees toward that idea over time.
I think the maximalist argument, I think there definitely is a place for that. I think what I'm seeing now, though, is a problem where kind of a stand on principle like that is seen as the most moral thing. And that I think Ryan has said, I've said already, there's really no room for prudence at all. You think that, working within our circumstances, even acknowledging that is somehow a giveaway. And so I think our political sense on the right in general, I think, is atrophied to a great extent. And so I think we need to become way more political. I mean, the irony of, like, say, looking at the moral majority in the 1980s, of looking at, say, the Tea Party, even of some other movements, is we actually need to be more political. You look at, say, evangelical voters, they actually need to vote in greater numbers than actually they do. The left is very good at mobilizing. The left is also very good at appealing to a certain kind of sense of justice. I think that's what they're doing when they're talking about these, things in principle, and we kind of ratchet slowly toward that. Well, why doesn't that happen on the right? Because I think that's where the culture is kind of leaning all the time. It's leaning toward the left, so the inertia is just going that way. So I think that's why it tends to work for the left and it doesn't work for us. But I would say for us, it's, all hands on deck. Make the maximalist argument. push things, like what Hadley Arcus has argued for a long time, make them defend. Basically, I mean, just absolute infanticide, put that on the ballot and make the voters actually see that that's what they're actually for. You look at even somebody like Kamala Harris. I mean, she voted against the Born Alive Infant Protection Act. You look at her record, insanely radical. You looked at Tim Walz's record in Minnesota, very, very radical. But then you also have to look at, again, you have to look at reality. You have to look at where we are as a people. I know this quote gets abused and just used so much, but John Adams talking about the Constitution only being fit for moral people, but that's fundamentally correct. You look at what we've become, you look at where we want to go, and that's going to take, again, a lot of work. It's the progressives. Look at how long it took them to march through the institutions, early progressives, then the new left. And it's going to take us a long time to get there. But we need to be able to understand what the principle is, but understand what can actually be achieved given these circumstances right now. And I think the right and the pro-life movement, I think, need to work on that. And I'll say one more thing, too. The pro-life movement, it's interesting just in their kind of chiding of Trump a lot recently, and that's completely understandable in some ways. Roe was only overturned because of Trump. Somebody outside of the movement, someone who had no fealty to them at all, did not grow up even, on the right as a conservative at all. So I think there needs to be some more thinking done on making kind of perfection kind of the idol in a way, understanding what Trump is trying to do. He's trying to build a national coalition given the circumstances. And I can understand pushback, and I can understand that some people are very angry over some of what's happened. I think JD Vance saying that Trump would even veto a national abortion legislation even if it came to his desk. I get that, but at the same time, I think we need to put these things in perspective and say, okay, the other side, if they get in, this is going to be very bad, and they're going to try to reinstitute Roe, and even more than that. So I think we just need to keep all these things in mind.
I'll just make a pitch. I still think the best book, the best resource to help think through these topics of not of abortion, but the very difficult topic of the problem of political principles and morality and politics remains Harry Jaffe's Crisis of the House Divided, and his discussion of the Lincoln Douglas debates. And there are some interludes in there that are particularly applicable to this sort of thing. Basically, two long reflections on the poles of Lincoln's young political and rhetorical skill. A reflection on his speech to the Men's Lyceum, which is about the problem of tyranny and mob justice, even in pursuit of noble ends, the mob justice in question being a lot of stuff around the race and the slaver question, and free speech for that matter. That's part of the context of his Lyceum address. And then his speech on his temperance address, where he kind of gently chides the temperance ladies that fanatical pursuit of purity in politics is also very dangerous. And it's kind of, I'll use the metaphor again. It is a kissing cousin of the problem of mob justice. And if you pursue either too incautiously, you tear at the civic fabric in a way that opens the door for something much worse, that is a real tyrant. So it remains a wonderful book and full of wisdom. And it's not about abortion at all, but it is about a very similar topic as we've tried to present it today in some ways, which is, who is a person when and how do you protect them?
Wow. All the important issues of the day dovetailing neatly to conclude with a pitch for Crisis of the House Divided. You won't get this kind of podcast content anywhere but the Claremont Institute. And we got to wrap it up. So thank you all. Thanks to my co-panelists. Thanks to all of our listeners for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to know more about all that we do at Claremont, you can visit our various websites. The one directly affiliated with this podcast is AmericanMind.org, where we post daily online commentary on the news of the day in relation to the founding principles. We also have our flagship quarterly, the Claremont Review of Books, at ClaremontReviewofBooks.com. And you can check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. If you want to donate to support any or all of these projects, we'd be most grateful. A little or a lot, everything helps. Claremont.org/donate. Thanks to our production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.